Hello everyone. So I've got an example here of some volumetrics that I rendered. One of these took 50 minutes, that is 50, and one of these took 6 minutes. And I don't think most people will be able to tell the difference. And I want to show you guys the very simple trick that I did to, it's not even trick, it's like intended functionality, but it's hardly talked about. Uh, I wanted to show you the trick that I did to reduce the render time on this almost tenfold. And it is absurdly simple. It's just changing this max steps here in this volumes tab in the render properties tab to 16. Now you don't have to set it to 16 exactly. This is just this example that I'm using for this video. But by default, it is set to 1024. And this is pretty much unworkably slow. And most people, when they want to optimize their volumetrics, they'll just say, hey, I'm going to turn the step rate up, and that makes it a lot faster. But there's a cost to that that isn't really there with the max steps parameter. And I'll explain why in a minute. But when I change this down to 16, you can see how much faster it is. I can move around. Yeah, it's not like super responsive, but keep in mind I also have a 4K monitor, so it's rendering a lot more pixels than it would on like a 1080p monitor. So for this trade-off, this is perfectly satisfactory for me. And then I want to briefly mention, if you want to get access to this cloud, I have it available on my Patreon. It's part of a cloud pack. There are about 15 of them. They're all super high quality. If you want to just buy this cloud individually, there is a link to a CG Trader page in the description where you can buy it individually if you want to follow along. And regardless of what you want to acquire, this cloud shader will also be made available. There's also a free pack in the CG Trader description, or link in the description, which also includes this cloud shader. Anyways, back on topic. I didn't mean to plug there, but you know, got that out of the way. So, why does this end up working a lot better than the step rate? So I just want to show you like a visual example of why this is a lot better. So I'm going to set this to 25 in the viewport. I'm going to set the max steps back up to what they were, 1024. So it is rendering fast, but we have these extremely fuzzy borders. And this is going to cue a lot of people into believing that the cloud itself is quite low detail, because there's just the silhouette is a lot less detailed. So this is why I don't like to change the step rate much. I instead prefer to change the max steps, because when I change this down to 16, so make note of the rendering performance here. I set this to 1. You can immediately tell, even like with 0 samples pretty much, how much more detailed these outlines are, right? So why does it do this? Why does this work extremely well for VDBs? So I'm going to draw a little diagram here. So this is going to be our camera. And then our camera shoots rays out into the scene. And that's how it gathers the lighting data for the pixels. And then when it hits a volume, which I'm just going to represent here, it will compute first one intersection where it enters the volume, and then one intersection where it exits the volume. And then it'll march the ray, sampling at points in the path between these two intersection points. And this is how it reads the volume data. So what does a lower step rate do? A lower step rate will mean that it takes a lot more samples, right? So the distance between the samples is extremely small. But a lot more samples means that there's a lot more like computation involved, right? So it's a lot slower. So if we set our max steps to something like 8 or 16, we can have an arbitrarily low step rate, and the renderer will just say, hey, don't take any more steps than whatever, let's just say 8 in this case. So it'll just instead take 8 steps here. And these 8 steps will be spread out over the entire path, right? So you might be wondering, why is this any different than just using a high step rate, right? Like they're fundamentally doing kind of the same thing. You're just spreading out the samples in the same way. But we've also seen very clearly that there is a difference between this and the high step rate, right? And one of them is clearly a lot better at resolving details a lot more efficiently. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lower my volume steps or my volume bounces to 0. And then I'm going to plug in a volume scatter shader into this volume here. And this is going to do something interesting. So this is the geometry of the VDB. I say geometry because it's not really visible to you, but it's visible to the render engine. So this is the surface that the renderer is computing the ray intersections with. And near the boundaries, the distance between the first intersection where it enters the volume and the last intersection where it exits the volume is a lot shorter around the borders, but it's a lot larger in the center, right? So the ray, if the ray has to enter here, it'll like pass like all the way through here, and that's just like a very long distance. But up here, you're only marching through like a couple of these boxes, right? So the fact that the VDB's sort of geometry will hug the actual VDB itself very, very tightly is actually extremely advantageous for our little rendering cheat here. So I'm just going to create like kind of an irregular shape here. So I'm just going to like create like this, I don't know, pair solid thing. So if we have a ray here, and let's say we have a low step rate, but a max steps set to 8, we can take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 steps here. And that is good. We are, looks like we're getting enough detail in there. And we aren't taking too much time. But if we didn't have this step rate, we're going to also take this amount or this distance of steps in between these very like distant points, right? So that's a lot more steps, right? And we don't really want that. So if we have a max steps of 8, it's going to compute these steps. That's even too small. Something like this, right? So we are really focusing on these narrow portions and really kind of optimizing the heck out of the like really bulky portions. So this is why in the comparison between the renders, we are getting a little bit less detail in these bits right over here. But of course, that is the trade-off for like 10 times more rendering performance. But importantly, there's like no difference between the silhouettes here. Like they're both sharp, both the ground truth and the optimized version. And I honestly don't really notice this difference too much in my renders. Like I'm mostly paying attention to the fine details on the silhouettes, all these really sharp details. It's kind of one of those things where it's like nice to have, but is it worth 10 times the rendering cost? I don't think so, but you can be the judge of that. So yeah, so we're taking a lot more steps where we want to be taking steps and a lot less steps that are being essentially wasted. So we've established this works very well for VDBs, but this isn't like a massive optimization for non-VDB volumes because this has a lot to do with the geometry that's like immediately hugging the VDB. So things like procedural volumes like this aren't getting a massive speed up. Neither are like these fog volumes. But also these fog volumes don't usually require much steps. And you can even like sometimes turn the homogeneous option on here which will make them like super, super fast. And there's one more limitation that's kind of a minor one, but this works really well for clouds and such because they're shaded very softly, right? Like all of the detail that you see in clouds normally is kind of confined to like their silhouettes, right? And their borders. But when you have a smoke VDB, you can lose a little bit more perceptual detail in these thick regions. And you can see a little bit more clearly how much more detail is on these edges. But the trade-off is that here, if I set this max steps to 512, yeah, it's going to get slower, but it's not going to get so much slower. Like a lot of the rendering performance impact of VDBs, especially like clouds, is in the multi-scattering, right? Because the rays will bounce a ton in your clouds, right? And that's going to just create a ton of like performance sink there. But when you have some like absorption, like in the case of most smoke, right? Like the ray will just bounce along like once or twice and then be on its merry way. Actually, it won't be on its merry way. It'll get absorbed and then it'll like effectively delete the ray. But you don't have to go through however many like 30 to hundreds of volume bounces inside the clouds. You can just focus on the first few, and that's like all you need. So even with like ground truth, like super detailed shading, like it's not that bad. Like the performance is fine, right? And usually these types of VDBs, these smokes, aren't like huge performance things. They're usually fairly okay to render. It's mainly the like clouds and such, especially if they're fairly large in the frame. Anyways, that is it for me today. Thank you for tuning in. This was a little bit more long-winded than I wanted it to be, but hopefully there is some cool info for you to digest there. As I mentioned before, links to the clouds will be in the description. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope this helped, and have a wonderful day. Bye. Oh, also, we've got a Discord, and the Discord is really cool, and you should totally join it. We got about 4,000 people in there at the moment, so do that. That would be much appreciated. Anyways, actually, bye-bye now.